Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm filming this intro after I filmed the rest of this video, so I have bangs right now because
I went to cut it after I filmed the video, and then after I filmed the video I realized that I needed an intro.
Anyways, yeah, just ignore how I look throughout the video. Ladies and gentlemen, this video is the behind the scenes video of my new story, A Brief Trip Through Nostalgia. Okay, so I recently finished a story called A Brief Trip Through Nostalgia. It is shown in my previous video, and this video, guys, is the part 2 of the previous video, which is part 1, which is me showing my story. So before I continue, if you haven't seen my previous video yet, please be sure to watch my previous video where I showed my story before coming back to this one, because all the things I'm going to say in this video connects and relates directly to the content of that video.
If that makes sense.
But if you have already watched that video and have seen my story, then this video is for you. In this video, I will share all of the behind the scenes stuff and the whole entire creative process of me finishing the story, all the way ranging from like how I got the very first spark of my idea to how I expanded that idea and built on that idea to form a story, how I structure my story, how and why I chose all of the time periods and the years that I included, and how I feel about the story afterwards, like what the story means to me personally.
Everything. So yeah.
Because I feel like the story is such a complex story to make. Like, it's not a complex story on its own, but it's such a long process creating it, so that I feel like it deserves its own behind the scenes video, just because like a lot went into it behind the scenes. So without further ado, let's get into it. First of all, I'm going to try to explain why the story took me so long to complete. To give you more context, I started drawing the story back in May of last year. So like a whole half year have passed since I finished. Well, the biggest reason for this is because of my amazing procrastination skills and my beautiful time management skills. Okay, but jokes aside, over the second half of 2022 of last year,
I was sort of a mess because I just started my first year of high school and I did not anticipate the workload.
I found it really hard to balance everything. There's just so much to do all at once, and I didn't know what to prioritize. So that's kind of why I didn't really prioritize drawing the story, so it took a long time to draw. But I guess the second reason was because of my ever-changing ideas. Like, over the entire process of drawing the story, I had so much ideas and I changed so much ideas. So I started actually drawing the story starting from May, but in August of last year, I suddenly realized that what I had completed wasn't actually what I wanted anymore. So during August, I literally started drawing my story all over again, because I have a harmful perfectionist syndrome, which does not really do me any good.
But technically I started the story, the final draft of the story, in August.
I completed the story, like I drew the last page, January, so last month, and here's a clip of me finally finishing the story. Now I'm going to tell you the whole entire process of me creating this story. The whole entire process from beginning to end, all the behind the scenes stuff, everything in between. I got my first little spark of idea for this story back in May of last year. Let me just give you some context about what's happening during that period. During like May/June of 2022, Beijing was in lockdown because of the coronavirus. What's new? It was just a whole silent life. During that time period when we were in lockdown, I was in a huge, gigantic, humongous Titanic phase. Around that time, I just watched it for the first time, so I was just in this huge new obsession, and you know how I'm like during my obsessions. So from watching Titanic and loving Titanic, I also started really loving the 90s, I feel like. So 2022 Jill, during lockdown, during her Titanic phase, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I wish I could have existed in the 90s where coronavirus didn't exist and when Titanic was released in theaters for the first time.
That was like the first spark.
So to give more context about myself, I have always loved the idea of existing in another era, whether it is the 90s or the 80s or the 50s or the 20s. Or it's not that I don't love the era that I'm in. I'm really grateful that I am in the time period that I'm in right now, but I just always thought about them, and it's probably because I've loved a lot of films from those time periods. And so one night I sat down with my mom and we were just chatting about like future potential projects, and I just sort of randomly brought up the topic of living in the 90s, and my mom was like, oh my gosh, you know what, this could actually be a great idea for a whole story. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're right, you're absolutely right. And I thought that during that time that if I drew this story, in a way, maybe I could fulfill my dream of being in the era. Because if I actually draw myself into those worlds, I could experience it actually on the page somehow. So I could just express myself through drawing the story. Okay, so now an idea was born. Then I had to figure out how to structure the story and all the elements that was going to go into the story. At that time, I only had the idea of the 90s, but I knew that if I wanted to create a story, I want to create a story about a lot of different time periods, which I've been obsessed with over the past years. As you saw in the story, ultimately I came up with 6 different time periods, 6 different years within those time periods which I traveled to. The 1800s, the 20s, the 50s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. I want to kind of go over like all of these time periods and why I wanted to include them. So the first year that I went to was 1813 in the 1800s. As you saw, it was me doing all these things with Jane Austen. Personally, I love period dramas. I've been obsessed with period dramas and Jane Austen.
And all those stuff, you know, Pride and Prejudice, and
I love the idea of the English countryside, and back in 2020, I would just imagine myself taking long walks in the English countryside because I loved how dreamy it seemed in Jane Austen film adaptations. And I chose the year 1813 because that was the year that Pride and Prejudice was first published. The next time period I chose, as you saw, was the 20s. When I went to the party in the mansion. So I chose the year 1925 because it was the year that The Great Gatsby was published. You know, the 20s is basically the roaring 20s, the jazz age in America, the American dream. Even though I'm pretty sure that Fitzgerald didn't write all that stuff about the roaring 20s to compliment it or praise it anyway. I think he was more of like commenting and criticizing this lifestyle maybe. I think. Nevertheless, I found like the roaring 20s really interesting. For the rich in the 1920s, everything seemed so over the top. Everything was so insane. It's just really glamorous, you know, the parties, fireworks. And for the third time period, as you saw, it was the 50s, which is also known as the golden age of Hollywood. So the golden age of Hollywood spanned around like these decades, around the 50s. And as a person who loves films and loves old Hollywood, of course I'm going to include that era in there. So I chose the year 1954 because it's sort of in the middle of the decade and I forgot the exact reason. And I think I mentioned this too many times.
But the love of my life is Audrey Hepburn. I love her with all of my heart.
I just remember I would think I wish I could have existed in the 50s or the 60s because Audrey was still around back then. And I also included Alfred Hitchcock because I feel like he's such an iconic director. The fourth time period was the 80s. Oh my gosh, the 80s. So I've always wanted to live in the 80s. Literally, like since I was in 4th grade, I would think to myself how fun it would be and how free it felt to live in the 80s. I didn't know a lot back then, but I would associate the 80s with like, you know, really vibrant colors. A lot of the 80s storyline was based on Stranger Things, you know, with the bikes and suburbs and malls and stuff. The 5th era, which I included, was of course the 90s, the one that started it all. So much of my favorite films were released in the 90s, and my favorite songs by Celine Dion, and also Harry Potter was first published in the 90s. It's just a lot of my favorite things combined in an era. I thought it was really cool, you know, with a leather jacket, shades, sunglasses. And lastly, I included the year 2010. It was a characters roundtable year, as you saw. Initially, I wanted to make the 2000s as the last time period I traveled through. And one thing I absolutely love about the 2000s was a lot of my favorite franchises and movie series or movie trilogies of all time was created in the 2000s. For example, you know, Harry Potter, The Lord of the Rings, Pirates of the Caribbean, the Dark Knight trilogy, The Matrix. And recently, I've also been really obsessed with the Hollywood Reporters Actors Roundtable interviews. Oh my gosh, guys, I literally live for those interviews.
Those are just so therapeutic, I feel like.
And so, as you saw, I combined these two ideas together. I combined the idea of the iconic characters and iconic franchises with the Hollywood Reporters Actors Roundtable interviews. So, hence, the Characters Roundtable was made. So basically, I just summoned all of either the most iconic or my favorite characters from the 2000s to sit around this roundtable to chat with the host, which is me, about the film industry. And I chose the year 2010 because, you know, it's the end of a decade, it's the start of a new decade. As I said, I love a lot of movie franchises in the 2000s, and since all of them were like released, of course, in different years, I just chose 2010 to bring them all together. And yeah, that's how I came up with all these time periods, and that's how I structured my story. Wow, so these are all the plannings, oh my gosh, that I made. The first page of planning that I did was actually this one. This was the first paper that I wrote on to plan for this story. So yeah, as you can see, it was May 16th of last year, and it says research page. I just wrote down all of the elements that could potentially exist in my story. So that was my first page of planning, you know, just jotting down all the research. And then I started to organize them into a timeline because then I can see it clearly. Actually, this is really unnecessary, but I just did this. So as you can see, here is a timeline of all these stuff, and on these timelines, I just wrote what I'm gonna do in my story in these eras, like selecting elements from there and taking it to here. On this page, I also did my character outfit designs. Some of these I definitely did not use.
Yeah, you can see that this is basically Elizabeth Bennet and this is basically Tina Golston. Yeah, anyways.
And that was that. And the most important one is, of course, my storyboards. Sorry, these are all like crumbled up because it existed for a long time now in this world. So I named the story Journey to the Past. Here I just sketched out all the pages that would exist. Like, I certainly made like changes. I deleted things, I added things when I actually drew the story, but this is just a storyboard prior to that, as you can see.
And yeah,
that's all my planning for this story. So basically, taking my anger for coronavirus, taking my wishes to live in other time periods, taking my love for stories and films, taking my obsessions for past stuff, and putting them all together into one story. So I feel like the story is sort of like a tribute for all of my favorite stuff.
Oh my gosh, the sunlight. Oh my gosh, why do I feel like this story is kind of like Everything Everywhere All at Once?
I swear, guys, when I finished the storyboards, when I started this story, I had no idea what EAO was, but I feel like my concept was sort of like that film, now that I really think about it. You know, both about like a confused protagonist, oh my gosh, the lighting, traveling around different worlds. Yay. And it's funny because Michelle Yeoh said in a lot of interviews that Everything Everywhere All at Once is sort of like a synthesis of her career as an actress, and I kind of feel that way for this story I drew. And I feel like this story challenged me in a lot of ways because, first of all, it's the longest story that I've ever drawn. Aside from its length, the content in it, like I don't think I've ever drawn a story including so many elements before. But yeah, you're finally watching this video, guys. This video finally came out. Yeah, I guess that's all I want to say about this story. If you're still here, thank you so much for staying. I will link my original story like playlist down below in my description box so you can like take a look and check out some of the stories I've drawn in the past years. And we're finally adding a new video to that playlist.
If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a like.
If you love stories, if you love movies, if you love doodles in general, please consider subscribing to my channel because those are like literally all I do on here. I hope I can return soon with another original story of mine, and I'll see you soon. Bye!